Today we're going to learn about the Great Depression. To begin, I'm going to show video from Plain Bagel that adequately and sufficiently describes and gives a great overview of the Great Depression in 5 minutes.
In the world of finance, we are often quick to forget the tragedies of the past, yet valuable lessons are to be had by exploring their causes and effects. After all, in a world of ever-changing rules, products, and services, in the world of finance, we are often quick to forget the tragedies of the past, yet valuable lessons are to be had by exploring their causes and effects. After all, in a world of ever-changing rules, products, and services, history is the one constant that can guide us through the ambiguity. So let's take a 5-minute history lesson on today's Plain Bagel. The year is 1918, and after 4 years of conflict, the First World War is finally over. America has emerged as one of the victors, and is about to enter a period of economic prosperity and cultural change known as the Roaring Twenties. Things start off pretty strongly, as the post-war economy is seeing a boost. Troops are back from the war, delayed projects are straightened up again, and hey, more women are entering the workforce, meaning that more people have a salary to spend, and companies are looking for a piece of the money pie. So in 1920, we see our first radio advertisement, and it seems to be working. Recent inventions like the vacuum cleaner and the electric washing machine are becoming hot commodities. And hey, since things are looking pretty good, the banks are giving out loans to everybody, meaning that even more people can buy the latest and greatest gadgets. Before you know it, everyone's getting a car too, Henry Ford's T-model to be exact, and with it, life is becoming a lot easier. Now you can do the Charleston across town and be home for your evening smoke. All of this is making companies very rich, and the average American is making good money for themselves. In fact, people are starting to look for things to do with their newfound wealth. Buy another laundry machine? Nah. A new car? Don't need it. Oh, wait, what about investing? Yeah, that's it. After all, why be rich when you can be more rich? So the stock market becomes a pretty popular practice, and with so many people buying, investors are finding it very easy to make money on stocks. Soon enough, everyone thinks they're 1920s Warren Buffett, and I mean everybody. Cooks, shoe shines, taxi drivers, you name it, everyone is trading like a Wall Street tycoon, pouring their life savings into whatever security is hot that day. In fact, there's so much money to be made, people are taking out loans to invest even more, and banks are happily collecting the interest. By the way, those same banks are looking to invest more money too, and soon enough they begin borrowing money from customer bank accounts to buy stocks. But since things are looking up, no one's noticing, and overall things are going pretty well in America, financially anyway, and as we experience flapper culture, prohibition, and the rise of jazz music, people are making good money on the markets. By 1929, America's total wealth has doubled, and investments are up 280% since 1922. In fact, stocks are rising so fast, companies are having a hard time keeping up and justifying their stock price. Wait, that's not good. And hold on, production actually seems to be slowing down. Henry's not making as many T-models, and people aren't buying as many things. It looks like companies may have overestimated their growth, and now wages are falling. And all that easy tax is debt? Well, people have taken out quite a bit, and interest rates are starting to rise. But wait a minute, the stock market is still up. That doesn't seem right. Even though the economy is looking worse for wear under the hood, investors are more or less ignoring these problems and buying and selling as if everything were exceptional. Sure, we see a few shakeups and close calls, but things are still largely positive, and people are still gambling on the markets. But over time, the voice of reason is getting louder, and investor uncertainty is increasing, which brings us to October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday as it's called, the theorized start of the Great Depression. Investors had been royally spooked, headlines reading, and when markets open, they start to sell, and I mean sell. 12.9 million shares to be exact, a new record, and at opening bell, things fall 11%. People are selling so much that price takers can't keep up with the volume, so people don't even know what their selling price is. And all this selling is dragging the stock market down, erasing large chunks of America's wealth, and things are about to get worse. While markets recovered later that day, come Black Tuesday, it's outright panic. The Dow Jones falls 12%, and that record we set last Thursday, we just broke it again. The markets lose $14 billion in one day. Some shares are now worthless, people have lost their life savings, and Americans who borrowed to invest are absolutely crushed. And so, friends, here we are, the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. The Dow Jones falls for another 3 years after this, losing 90% of its value from its high in 1929. Many lose their jobs as companies shut down, and it's not just investors that are hit. Remember that money the banks borrowed? Well, a bunch of it is lost in the markets too. People are only getting back 10 cents for every dollar they had in their account. Banks across the country shut down, and unemployment reaches its highest level in U.S. history, 24.9%. By this point, breadlines, soup kitchens, and homelessness are common sights. Whether you invested, borrowed money, or even just held money in a bank account, the Depression found a way to hurt you financially. Times would be tough throughout the 1930s, and fiscal intervention from Franklin D. Roosevelt would do little to boost activity. In fact, it wouldn't be until the rise of the Third Reich in Germany that we would see an end to the crisis. You see, the Great Depression wasn't just felt in America. Rather, with recent globalization, its effects were felt around the world. And in the darkness, we saw the rise of Hitler, who used the despair of the German people as a rallying call, ultimately leading to the creation of the Nazi Party and the start of the Second World War in 1939. The war created jobs in America, ironically ending one tragedy with the start of another. Experts can't agree on why the Great Depression was as bad as it was, but there were valuable takeaways from the hardship. It demonstrated just how powerful the greed and alternatively the fear of the markets can be when they get out of control, while demonstrating the destructive potential of speculation and debt. Laws would later be introduced to safeguard financial institutions and deposits, and during his time in office, Franklin A. Roosevelt would introduce the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission, institutions targeted at protecting the wealth of Americans that still exist to this day. Few are left who remember the hardships of the Depression, but we'd be foolish to forget the lessons it provided. After all, fear, greed, and speculation are far from dead.
Hey guys, thank you so much for
I hope that video really explained what the Great Depression was and was an overview for you, and that this Edpuzzle is going to go into more detail. And yes. Okay, so to start off, people were kicked out of their homes for their inability to pay because they lost their jobs. Shanty towns were little towns that were made of shacks, and then one person from Oklahoma described these towns. They said, "Here were all these people living in old, rusted-out car bodies. There were people living in shacks made of orange crates. One family with a whole lot of kids were living in a piano box. People were living in whatever they could junk together." So basically a shanty town, as the speaker said, it was whatever people could gather together in order to keep them out of the elements. As you can imagine, these people were really struggling at this time, and they were just trying to find somewhere to lay their head down at night. Luckily, soup kitchens were available at a limited capacity for families that were unable to afford food, and they were low cost or free. And same with bread lines. That they had a long line of people constantly trying to get food for themselves and their families, and this food was donated by charities or public agencies. The Great Depression was worse on minorities, such as African Americans and Latinos, because unemployment rates were much higher for these groups of people, and they were the lowest paid individuals. Violence also increased related to these groups because white people felt that they did not deserve the jobs that they were trying to get, meaning the white people felt that these minorities were taking jobs that they deserved. Sadly, in 1933, 24 African Americans died by lynching. Latinos, most of which at the time were Mexican or Mexican Americans, were targets for the white people as well. Even the Latinos who were born in America were urged to be deported by the white population because, again, they felt like this group of people were taking their jobs. Hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican descent relocated to Mexico by deportation or voluntarily left. The advantage of living in rural areas at this time was that farmers were able to grow their own crops, whereas people living in the city didn't have this opportunity. But thousands of farmers lost their land due to foreclosure. And foreclosure is basically the process that the mortgage holder takes back property if an occupant has not made payments. So the way that works is that, say the bank gives you a loan to buy a house. If you do not make payments on that loan, then they'll just take your house. It's the same concept here. Whoever gave the loan for these farmers to buy their farms took back their property because the farmers were unable to pay them. Many of these farmers were forced to go back to tenant farming, where, if you remember, this was farming off other people's land and only receiving a portion of the profit. In the early 1930s, the Dust Bowl hit the Midwest hard, as if the Great Depression wasn't bad enough. Before this time, farmers were not really taking care of the land. They were using tractors to plow the land because they were producing a great amount of crops. So they needed a type of plowing that was quick. But eventually, this type of farming led to the breakdown of the protective layer of prairie grass. And then in the early 1930s, there was a major drought that made the conditions worse of an already weary situation. There was little vegetation to hold the soil down, so wind just scattered it all over the place. The dust was carried by the winds thousands of miles. To give you an example, one windstorm in 1934 carried millions of tons of dust from the plains to the East Coast cities. The states that were hardest hit were Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. These were the areas that came to be known as the Dust Bowl. Many of the individuals and families who lived in these areas packed up what little belongings they had and headed west on Route 66 towards California. If you can remember, we learned that Route 66 travels from Chicago to California, and this is the same road that these people use to migrate. Many of these migrants became known as Okies, which eventually became a derogatory term for all migrants. By the end of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of farm families had migrated to California and other Pacific Coast states. The Great Depression brought many families closer together, and these families passed the time often by playing board games. In fact, Monopoly was invented in 1933. Other pastimes included listening to the radio. And if you'll remember, as we learned in our last couple lessons, that the radio was the main source of news at this time. It was sort of new technology, and this was one of the first times that people were able to listen to the news as it was happening. Before this, they would have to wait for it to be printed in the paper, and then there was the issue of a lack of literacy. So this was the first time people were able to really get their news firsthand. Well, the early 20s was the first time, but there were some families who were unable to handle the pressure of being financially unstable and broke apart. Many men struggled more with the fact that they were unemployed and unable to find work. They felt like they were not fulfilling the responsibility of supporting their family. Many walked the streets to find any kind of work. Some men simply gave up on finding work, and some even went as far as to abandon their family. During the Great Depression, there were about 300,000 hobos, which were people who wandered the country on railroad boxcars and slept under bridges. Most of them were men. Thomas Wolfe described these individuals as wanderers from town to town, the riders of freight trains, the thumbers of rides on the highways, the uprooted, unwanted male population of America. They gathered in big cities when winter came, hungry, defeated, empty, hopeless, restless, always on the move, looking everywhere for work, for the bare crumbs to support their miserable lives, and finding neither work nor crumbs. This was a really, really sad situation. And what made it even more difficult for these people is that there was no direct relief system at this time, which basically means that the government was unable, and you could go as far to say as unwilling, to provide cash payments or food to the poor. There were some charities and cities that attempted to provide relief, but it was not much. For example, New York City, the weekly was just $2.39 per family, $2.39 per family. And this was the most generous relief offered by any city, but it was still well below the amount needed to feed a family. So in New York City, each family was paid $2.39 as a wage to try to support their family, but that was not nearly enough. And if you look at the picture that I have here, it says, "I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, and no work for 3 months. But I only want 1 job." So this kind of shows, like, despite the intelligence and the ability that people had, they were still unable to find jobs during this time. They were just not available for anyone, really. So during this time, women really struggled. They attempted to keep their head above the water by canning food and sewing clothes. They also worked really hard to keep a carefully managed budget. Jean Weston describes the situation in her book, Making Do: How Women Survived the 30s. And she says, "Those days you did everything to save a penny. My next door neighbor and I used to shop together. You could get 2 pounds of hamburger for a quarter, so we'd buy 2 pounds and split it. Then one week she'd pay the extra penny, and the next week I'd pay." This is just one example of how people would try to save money, women specifically, whatever they could do. Women up the positions of the men who were forced to go overseas to fight the war. And they wanted to continue working outside the home because they felt that sense of freedom and ability to bring home money for their family. But they generally received less pay than men who worked the same job. There was also animosity towards working women from men, and even some women, as you see in the picture here. And this was very similar to that the African American and Latinos communities received at this time. In fact, married women were sometimes refused jobs because they thought that their husbands were bringing home enough food, so there was no need for the woman or the wife to work too. There were few women that were seen begging or standing in bread lines, so it was thought that they were having an easier job than men, or easier time than men within the Depression. One writer pointed out that women were often ashamed to do things such as these. They said in their statement, "I've lived in cities for many months, broke, without help, too timid to get in bread lines. I've known many women to live like this until they simply faint in the street. A woman will shut herself up in her room until it is taken away from her, and eat a cracker day and be quiet as a mouse. She will go weeks, verging on starvation, going through the streets ashamed, sitting in libraries, parks, going days without speaking to a living soul, shut up in the terror of her own misery." That gave a very vivid description of some of the stories of these women. Obviously, by this description, women in fact were not having an easier time with the lack of resources. They were just hiding their struggle a little bit better than the men. Children were also deeply affected by this situation. There was a lack of money for health care, and poor diets led to serious health problems, especially in kids. Also, milk consumption decreased, so there was a dramatic rise in malnutrition and diet-related diseases. Programs related to children were also cut, so there was no available resources to help them. School years were also cut, or schools were even closed because there was no available tax money to pay for it. By 1933, some 2,600 schools across the nation had shut down, leaving more than 300,000 students out of school. Thousands of children went to work instead. They often labored in sweatshops under horrendous conditions. A great deal of teenagers, hundreds of thousands in fact, boarded trains and went across the country to find work or just to simply escape from poverty. The individuals who went on these journeys were mostly teenage boys who became known as Hoover tourists. But these adventures were not without danger. Many were beaten or jailed by bulls, which were armed freight yard patrolmen. Some people were even accidentally locked in ice cars for days on end, or brutally murdered by criminals. From 1929 to 1939, 24,647 trespassers were killed and 27,171 injured on railroad property. Many people were psychologically affected by the situations they faced during the Great Depression. I don't mean to give you even more sad statistics, but between 1928 and 1932, the suicide rate rose more than 30%, and 3 times as many people were admitted to state mental hospitals as in normal times. People were also forced to make hard decisions facing their lives and their futures. Adults stopped going to the doctor or dentist because they couldn't afford it. Young people gave up on their dreams of going to college. Others put off getting married, raising large families, or having children at all. It was the goal of most to achieve financial success and security within their lifetimes. People also showed a great deal of kindness between strangers during this terrible time. They learned the skills of thriftiness and saving, which would impact their entire lives. I apologize for this being such a sad section, but it will get better in the future when America recovers from this depression. But that only comes after we enter World War II, so it will be a while.